Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to speak about a really beautiful vintage acquisition I have for my collection, which is this wonderful Universal Genève from 1959. But before I speak about the watch, I'd like to speak really about Universal Genève as a brand, because this is a very interesting brand which has disappeared into the pages of history, and which really is no longer anything that it used to be in terms of its integrity as a high-end brand in the world of luxury watches. In terms of history, Universal Genève were founded in 1894 under the name of Universal Watch, and their first recognisable piece in terms of being a venture into the world's fame was their 1917 release of their first wrist-mounted chronograph. Now, it should also be noted that this brand as a whole is known really for three pieces, and they're the three pieces which are most valuable from this brand, but also the ones which are most remembered by people. The first, of course, is the release of the Compax. And the Compax was released in 1935 as a high-precision and generally very competitive chronograph. And it served that purpose extremely well, though I must admit the recognition of this watch, in my eyes at least, is seen in the 1940s, 50s and 60s, as well as some pieces in the 70s, with famous pieces such as those worn around the Formula One track, as Universal Genève and their Compax was becoming something of a more colourful piece in those 60s and 70s era Formula One times, where I think the glory age of Formula One came, and one sees individuals such as Nina Rindt wearing one on the wrist. Now their second great breakthrough, I'd say, was their 1944 release, and indeed this has been described by a great many journalists as the case, is their 1944 release for their 50th anniversary of the Tri-Compax. And the Tri-Compax is very greatly remembered as its position as a very dressy chronograph. And it was dressy in the sense that both the case was simple and polished, and in my eyes very beautiful, but also in the sense that it was a triple calendar moon phase chronograph. So one had an extremely complicated watch, and whilst this wasn't an annual or a perpetual calendar, it still is certainly a feat to be able to pack all of this into a single movement, and of course it achieved this extremely well for its 50th anniversary. And these pieces command a very, very high price nowadays in terms of pieces to acquire easily, and certainly have moved well beyond the realms of the amateur collector's area. But the third piece is probably their most popular watch, and certainly their most well-known amongst the vast majority of people, and that's the Polerouter, or the Polerouter if you're here from the UK. And this was a piece that was released following the 1954 flight of the SAS flight, i.e. the Scandinavian Airlines System flight, over the North Pole. And they didn't, and I think this should be stated, they didn't wear Polerouters on that flight. The reason why it was a watch which was associated with that fact was because during the flight they wore chronometers from Universal Genève, and they used a bumper system and were chosen for their anti-magnetic properties in terms of being protected from the elements. And in sort of homage, if you will, to this particular event, Universal Genève employed the very young at the time Gerald Genter, the famous designer later of the Patek Philippe Nautilus and Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, to design the Universal Genève Polerouter. And it was originally the Polerouter, but then was changed to the Polerouter, and famously had those beautiful twisted lugs, a wonderful dial with multiple layers and areas, and a fascinating build in terms of being a wonderfully beautiful watch, and then of course later incorporated their famous 215 caliber. And the 215 was their micro-rotor movement, which wasn't the one used by that SAS flight. That used a bumper movement that was then used in the Polerouter. But in terms of the micro-rotor version, the watch itself did enjoy a very interesting history, and is now celebrated, and prices go up with every month that passes by. And so they are wonderful pieces to get hold of if you can, especially since they were some of the very early creators of the micro-rotor, though I believe there was a dispute between Universal Genève and Buren in terms of who created the first. Of course, as with anything, the Polerouter comes in a variety of variants, from versions which are well known, such as the twisted lug version in steel or gold capped models, to very rare models such as the Sub with its diving credentials and dive watch build, in addition to curious pieces such as the Super, which had a far more simple case and dial to the standard Polerouter, and acted as an interesting counterpart to that collector's piece. And of course prices vary between a few £100 and a few £1,000, and this watch comes from the 1950s, the late 1950s in fact, as more of a dress watch, and so comes before the 1967 purchase of the Universal Genève brand by Bulliver, and then its sale in the mid-1980s into several different companies now, and different strains, which has led to today's point where actually there are a great many different companies owning rights to the name. And since 2001's attempted restart of the brand itself, very little has been heard from the brand, and as far as I'm concerned, the brand is finished. And so it means this is an interesting look into the past, in terms of an interesting piece, which is built in such a different way to a modern watch, and the difference is so fundamental, from the hands to the build of the case, to the way they've gone about assembling it. Now, I saw this watch about a month ago now, and I bought it relatively soon after seeing it, just because of the condition of the watch. The fact the dial is beautifully finished and actually isn't restored or messed with, and hasn't suffered any moisture damage, with the hands developing a slight patina, in addition to an extraordinarily well-preserved movement, and of course a fully original crown as well. The watch itself was bought from the very, very pleasant individuals at Vintage and Watches. Now you can find them on Instagram, or indeed on their website. They're based in Budapest in Hungary, and they were a real pleasure to deal with in terms of being able to give me all the information I would want to know about the watch, and this rather remarkable bracelet it comes on. So it was really a pleasure to buy from them, and that's the reason why I'm mentioning them, because they were just so good with me. And I think it's important to support sellers who are reputable and who are trustworthy, because there are a lot of frauds out there, and people who don't quite support the customer in the way they should. So to see someone who does is really fantastic. And so this is a watch which I can't name in terms of a model, but it's a piece which I've seen before in terms of variants, and is a very delicate dress watch with a case size of between 33 and 34 millimeters in diameter, a 40 millimeter lug-to-lug length, and about an 8 millimeter thickness, or indeed a 4 millimeter thickness if you exclude that beautifully domed plexiglass crystal, and this wonderful matted silver dial, which, as you can see, gives the most fantastic view into the time, with no date. As you can see, it's a very simple watch, simply giving the time, and having that very simple 5 beat a second run of the second hand. And in terms of the way that the dial is assembled, it's something which is so old-fashioned, yet wonderful to see, because you can see the font is of its era. Now, I've managed to date this watch, based upon its references which are on the back, to 1959 as the manufacture date of this watch, which is incredible to think about, bearing in mind this watch is nearing its 60th birthday. It really is wonderful to be able to witness something of this age in such phenomenal condition. And in terms of the design of the dial, you can see the font is something of a different era. It's delicately done, it's very fine, and in many ways it's very simple, but done in a way which simply isn't seen anymore. Likewise, the indices are applied to the surface of the dial, and of course you can see them being distorted by the shape of the crystal, but are very, very well applied and still beautifully polished, with very few signs of any sort of blemishes on them, and any marks you might see on the crystal are just marks in the crystal itself, not on the dial. And so you can see there's no moisture damage to the dial whatsoever, which is wonderful to see, bearing in mind the fact that this dial is the age it is. In addition to that, one sees the wonderful Universal Genève logo, which helped to pinpoint the age of the watch, because their logo changed every few years, and so one was able to figure out exactly when this watch was from, in addition to the serial number on the back of the watch. The hands are wonderful things to behold as well, because as you can see, the way the hands have been built is reminiscent in some ways of something like a Rolex Datejust. So if we look at the second hand first, it has a flat centre to that central section, but around the edges you can see the length of the hand, the full length of the hand, has been curved around its edge in the most wonderful form, and has tarnished to a bluey grey over time, which makes it both incredibly legible, but also very, very beautiful to behold. And of course, with a watch of this age, it is interesting to see the beat rate of about 5 ticks a second, which isn't something you see very often these days, and it's quite incredible to see. And one thing I appreciate about this watch is that, unlike the manually wound Omega movements, which I've used and worn before of this particular period, it's not an indirect second hand. So when you move the watch around, the second hand doesn't stutter. As a result of that, it remains perfectly true and keeps running wonderfully. And of course you can see it is curved downwards to avoid the inside of that plexiglass crystal. The other hands themselves are Dauphine-style hands, and if I just move them apart, as you can see, they show the most wonderful curve over the top of the hand, with a curvature which has been polished, and of course they have tarnished over time, and from what I can see, it hasn't damaged the structure of the hand at all, with a few marks on the surface where the surface of the hand has developed a patina as a result of simple exposure to time. But the luminescence, which is tritium on this watch, still remains in place, as you can see, as indeed around the edge of the dial, which is incredible for the age of the watch, and something which I appreciate, especially since when I saw the watch, the seals, for example, did need replacing, and so I was very pleased to have the seals around both the case back and the crown replaced, in order to keep the watch in running and a usable specification on a daily basis. Now, moving over to the sides, you can see the lugs are fairly simple, and the case is fully polished in steel, with the top of the lugs curving downwards, giving an 18mm lug width, which is very usable, and I have bought some other straps for this watch, in addition to the wonderful bracelet, which I'll talk about in a bit, because it is just such a glorious thing to behold. And in terms of the originality of this watch, I love the fact the crown is a matching piece. As you can see, it's the same logo, the same period, and I've examined this watch against other existing versions of this particular timepiece, and they do have the same crown, which is a wonderful stainless steel affair and is nice and large, which, bearing in mind the watch is manually wound, is very much appreciated. And of course the quality of the crown really is excellent, with, as you can see, the Universal Genève logo there. There are very few dings in the case, which is something I appreciate, bearing in mind the age of the watch. And you can see the bracelet has rubbed on the back, but this is a watch which I don't imagine was worn every day, or at all regularly for the last 60 years, bearing in mind the condition it's in. Now, internally, the watch uses the in-house Universal Genève manually wound caliber 1105. And the beautiful thing about this movement is that it's fully decorated. If you look around the movement, underneath the balance, around all of the movement parts, in addition to the various winding wheels, the spring barrel, all of these parts are beautifully decorated. And I find this curious because, of course, you can't see them through the caseback, because in this period exhibition casebacks just didn't exist. And admittedly, this does reduce the thickness of the watch quite significantly, but also means you can't get to witness the beauty of that movement, which really is staggering, which I was able to see when the seals were being replaced, and the watch was being examined by a watchmaker. And so, in terms of a piece of this age, it's wonderful to be able to see a piece of such originality, to be able to see the fact that even the tritium markers are still in place, and of course don't glow anymore, and indeed are no longer functional. And then, of course, there's the small Swiss signature at the bottom of the dial, which just adds to the wonder and curiosity of peering around the watch and catching a glimpse of that polished retort around the edge of the dial, which is a really wonderful piece to look at. The bracelet that this watch comes on is a thing of great beauty. Now, I don't know if this bracelet is original. It certainly isn't something of a modern bracelet, because the build just doesn't fit with anything past about 1970. This is a bracelet which really does look quite beautiful in terms of its finishing, because the structure of the bracelet is gold-plated. It's white gold-plated, which does give a curious look to the bracelet itself, in terms of being something very different to what you would expect. And bearing in mind the fact that the bracelet slots through itself, I am somewhat concerned about it rubbing its own plating off as a result of metal-on-metal contact. So I don't think I'll wear this bracelet on an everyday basis, but then this isn't an everyday watch. It's a piece to be taken out on special occasions, so it's a real pleasure to be able to wear a bracelet like this on it. But as you can see, the bracelet itself has incredible fluidity and is brushed along its top, with this wonderful form which behaves like a Milanese mesh bracelet, but indeed is this fish scale pattern of these hexagons, which interlink, and as you can see, have been put in place with a number of pins, and then brought back together to create a very, very fine lattice of links that create a very, very fluid form and match the case beautifully. On the wrist, you can see how a watch of this style in this period was designed to fit. These were designed to be smaller watches, around the 34 to 33 even millimetre size. And the curious thing is that whilst my wrist is just below 7 inches in circumference, I don't see any problem with wearing a watch of this size. It's a beautifully sized piece, and one which actually supports itself very well, especially on the bracelet, which, as you can see, clamps down upon itself and gives an incredibly comfortable fit, but also a beautiful aesthetic. And this is probably the watch I've been asked the most questions about in the whole time I've been collecting watches, just because of that bracelet. People say it's something they've never seen before, and in truth I'd never seen a bracelet like this before. But I'm incredibly impressed to be able to see one like this, and I doubt I'll ever see one like this again. in terms of something of this intricacy and this detail. In fact, really, the bracelets that spring to mind when I think of a bracelet like this are perhaps even the bracelet that was seen on the Rolex Daytona, which sold quite recently for several £1,000,000. Of course, this is a bracelet which isn't of the same materials, but it's still a curious piece to have in the collection, something really very beautiful, especially on the wrist. But what I love about this watch is the comparison between this and indeed a modern counterpart. A very interesting comparison to this watch is the Longines Conquest Heritage. And this is the 35mm sized piece, and as you can see is relatively comparable in terms of its sizing to the Universal Genève. And what I find curious is that these are two interpretations of 1950s or 1960s watches. And of course this is an original, whilst this is a remake. But I find the way in which the feel of the two watches is different is very, very interesting. Because in a photograph it's very easy to say, oh well, the Longines looks exactly like its historical counterpart. But it is curious to see how two watches of different periods feel. Even in the way the crystals are built. For example, the crystal on the Universal Genève has a very clear, of course it will focus, a very clear bulge to it, and appears almost ungainly and without a great deal of care taken when they created the crystal as simply an afterthought, something which was needed for a watch. By contrast, the Longines, one can clearly see they've considered and tried to produce the best balance of a slim and usable crystal and to catch that history of a Hesalite domed crystal. Furthermore, if one looks around the watch, I find the amount of text we see on modern watches very, very curious, because you can see there's all the serial numbers, stainless steel, heritage this, in addition to the water resistance. Whereas on vintage watches, and this is so often the case, the markings are almost absent. There's the bare minimum giving the reference of the watch, and indeed the reference of this type of model. That's all. Which creates a very curious dynamic between the modern and the vintage watch, in addition to the fact the way the dials are treated. The modern watch is almost too good. The quality of modern watches really is something different to vintage watches, and I think people often misunderstand this. Modern watches are generally better made in terms of the parts themselves being held together, the modern machining, the modern techniques, in terms of a technical perspective, are probably better watches than vintage watches. But even in this Conquest Heritage, with its vintage-inspired Dauphine hands and its beautifully cut indices, somehow the vintage piece has a charm in its simplicity, having writing and text, which is so basic and simple. It has its own charm. And so I don't know what really a comparison between these two watches is worth, but I think it's a curious one to consider, especially when getting hold of a vintage watch like this, being able to see it next to its modern reinterpretation, or a modern reinterpretation of that style of dress watch. And so as I draw to the end of this video, I've tried to change up the style of this video to make it a bit more interesting in terms of looking at this new acquisition from a more conceptual standpoint, a historical standpoint, to really look at this brand Universal Genève as something a bit more than one of these simple discontinued and finished brands of the past. And so I'll be curious to hear what you have to say and what you think about this video and this watch itself, because it's a curious piece in terms of showing something really wonderful about the world of vintage pieces, with a great deal of charm and in fantastic condition for its age, with a beautiful bracelet. And so I think it'll complement the collection rather nicely, and I think this watch does prove that a great deal of watches that are vintage and aren't from the most well-known of brands are still very accessible on the vintage market. You can still get hold of these watches at very reasonable prices with very, very high quality in terms of what there is to find, and simply in terms of being wonderful watches to own as a collector, and something to inspire thought and inspire something a bit different to the conventional considerations made when buying a watch of pure specifications. Because I think the way that watches were made in the past is very different. And whilst it's not necessarily inferior, apart from perhaps some technical aspects such as the beat rate of watches, the water resistance, and these points, I feel that they're very different watches to hold. Their feel is fundamentally different, which is why I would inspire any budding collector, whether they have a great deal of money to spend or just a few £10 notes, to buy a vintage watch of some nature, take a look at it, examine it for quality, and to acquire one, because they really do teach you a lot about ownership and about how watches have changed. And if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe, and do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of the video. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.